All right, let's jump into this deep dive. Curt, you know our senior technical writer, Curt Robbins, right? Well, he requested this one. So, Curt, this one's for you. We're tackling documentation, improving it, that is, but at scale. And that's the tricky part, especially for open source projects. We're going to be looking at a talk to help us unpack all this. It's called, get this, Improving Documentation at Scale. And it's by Paul Gustafson. He's the CEO over at Expert Support.
A great resource.
Definitely. And speaking of resources, the Linux Foundation's Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNFC, has, get this, 170 projects.
Whoa.
I know, right? And they all need documentation help. So this deep dive is really for anyone out there who's dealing with documentation. Technical writers, obviously, documentation experts, IT pros. If you touch docs, this one's for you.
Oh, for sure. It's a huge need in open source. I mean, documentation resources, they're often, well, lacking. And developers, let's face it, they're amazing at coding, building incredible things. But they're not always, shall we say, the best writers.
Right. Their talents lie elsewhere.
Exactly. And then there's the funding issue. Let's be real. Funding for professional writers is, well, it can be hard to come by, especially in the open source world.
So we got this huge demand for great docs, but not a lot to work with. How do we crack this nut?
Oh, well, that's what Paul and his team at Expert Support really dove into with, you guessed it, the CNFC Documentation Assistance Program.
That sounds promising.
It is. And they've got a smart approach, a two-pronged approach, really, training and analysis. But don't worry, they're not trying to turn every engineer into, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author or anything.
Wait, you're not suggesting we try to make engineers into professional writers, right?
No. It's not about that. It's about establishing a baseline, getting everyone on the same page about why documentation matters, why it's so important. You'd be surprised what a difference even a basic understanding can make. And here's the cool part.
Okay, tell me.
They actually created free training courses, and they're available through the Linux Foundation training site.
Nice. So anyone can access them.
Yep. Super accessible, which is, of course, key in the open source world.
Absolutely. So that takes care of training. But what about analysis? What's their approach there?
That's where things get really interesting. They basically ditched that old report card style of feedback, where you just go through and grade the existing documentation.
Yeah, I could see how that wouldn't go over well.
Right. Nobody likes getting a bad grade, especially developers who are already stretched thin.
So what do they do instead?
They flip the script. Instead of focusing on what's wrong, they focus on what's missing, identifying gaps and needs. It becomes a much more collaborative process, more constructive. Instead of saying, hey, this section is unclear, you say, we could really make the section shine by adding an example here. What do you think? Subtle shift, but super effective.
That's a great point. It's all about framing. Focusing on what's missing instead of what's wrong is, well, it just makes for a much better working relationship, don't you think?
Absolutely. You're building trust, working together, and that's critical when you're dealing with developers.
Totally. But let's back up a bit. How do you even get started with that kind of analysis, that collaborative approach? I mean, where do you even begin?
Well, one thing Paul's team emphasized is the importance of credibility, building that trust early on. They found that if they could find one quick win task, something impactful they could tackle right away for each project, it made a world of difference. It showed they were there to help, not just criticize.
So quick wins are key.
Exactly. Like a small victory builds momentum.
What kind of quick wins are we talking about? Give me an example.
Could be something simple, really. Maybe reorganizing the structure of the documentation. Or updating a key piece of information that's outdated. Even just fixing some broken links can go a long way, just something to show the developers, hey, we're here to make your lives easier.
Yeah, those little things can make a big difference. It's like you get a few of those under your belt, and suddenly everyone's more open to, to bigger changes.
Momentum builds, exactly.
Speaking of bigger changes, I'm curious about how they approach the bigger picture. How do they tackle those really complex projects where the documentation is, it can be a bit of a beast?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something they definitely address. I mean, think about it. With open source, you often have documentation scattered all over the place. You've got specs, blog posts, comments in the code itself. It can be,
a nightmare.
Pretty much. It's like a scavenger hunt, trying to piece together a coherent picture from a million different sources.
Ugh, I've been there. So how do you bring order to that chaos?
Well, the first step, they say, is to define clear user roles. Who is this documentation for? End users, IT folks, developers. Contributors.
Oh.
Once you know who you're writing for, then you can start organizing the information in a way that actually makes sense for each group.
Oh, that makes so much sense. If you don't know who you're writing for, you're just shooting in the dark, right?
Totally. It's like trying to write a travel guide without knowing if your readers are, seasoned globetrotters or first-time backpackers.
Perfect analogy.
Right. You need to know your audience. And then once you've got those clear user roles and you've got a solid structure in place, well, then you can start breaking down the work into smaller, more manageable chunks. Paul calls them bite-sized issues.
Bite-sized issues. I like that. What are those exactly?
They're basically small, well-defined writing assignments, the kind of things that junior technical writers or even volunteers can tackle.
So it's a great way to get more people involved, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes contributing to open source documentation much less intimidating. Plus, it allows for more focused feedback, faster turnaround times. It's a win-win.
Totally. So if you're a junior tech writer out there trying to build your portfolio, contributing to open source documentation could be a great way to go. You get experience, and the project gets some much-needed help. But what about the really complex stuff? The concepts that are hard to explain, even to, experienced developers. How do you make that information, well, accessible?
That's a tough one for sure. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What are some of the tactics they use to make these complex docs, well, more digestible? What are they doing that works?
Yeah, give us the goods.
Well, one thing that Paul really hammered home was the importance of visuals. Diagrams, flowcharts, even a simple illustration. Sometimes a visual just conveys the information so much better than a wall of text.
A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? I mean, visuals are key.
They really are. They can break down these complex processes, show the relationships between different parts, make those abstract concepts just click.
It's like the difference between reading a recipe and watching a cooking show, right? Sometimes you just need to see it to get it.
Exactly. And speaking of seeing it, think about screenshots, screencasts, especially for software documentation. It's like having someone walk you through the interface, step by step. No guesswork.
So much easier than trying to figure it out from a dense paragraph of text. Come on. Visuals are a documentation superhero's secret weapon, wouldn't you say?
I'd say so. Think about your own documentation. Are you using visuals to their full potential? Are you really choosing visuals that add value, make things clearer?
It's not about just throwing in random images, right? It's got to be strategic.
Exactly. And while we're on the subject of visuals, we can't forget accessibility. We got to make sure everyone can benefit from them, including people with disabilities.
That means alternative text for images. Clear, concise language in diagrams and charts, and then making sure those colors and contrast work for people with visual impairments.
Right. Because accessibility is not just a box to check. It's about making sure everyone has equal access to information. It's about being inclusive.
And that's a consideration for every single piece of documentation we create, right?
Every single one. One thing Paul talked about was consistency in the documentation, that is. Consistent formatting. Using the same terminology throughout. Consistent style.
It makes everything feel more cohesive, right? More professional.
Exactly. It's like imagine if you were driving in a city and the street signs changed on every block.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
Total chaos. But when you've got that consistency, it makes the documentation easier to read, easier to understand, easier to navigate. People can find what they need. And speaking of quality, I think it all boils down to, collaboration, whether you're working with developers to make sure everything is accurate, or getting feedback from users to see what needs improvement, or even just collaborating with other technical writers to share knowledge. I mean, collaboration is key. And, Paul's team at Expert Support, they use this approach all the time. It makes contributing to open source, especially for newcomers, way less daunting.
It's like you're not asking them to climb Mount Everest, right?
Exactly.
It's more like, hey, let's just, hike up this little hill first, get your bearings.
And that makes a huge difference. But you know what? This principle applies to any type of documentation, really. Doesn't have to be open source.
It's like building a house. You don't try to lift the whole thing at once, right? You start with one brick, make sure it's level, secure, then you move on to the next one.
It's about those small steps, those incremental wins.
That reminds me of something else Paul talked about, the importance of constantly iterating, improving your documentation. It's never really done, is it?
Never. Documentation is a living thing, constantly evolving.
We got to keep updating it, refining it, make sure it's meeting your users' needs.
Yeah.
Which, of course, are always changing, right?
Always. And that means being open to feedback, willing to experiment.
I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you learned a thing or two about how to improve your documentation.
And if you want to learn even more, be sure to check out Paul Gustafson's talk, Improving Documentation at Scale. It's packed with great insights.
And don't forget those resources we mentioned. Expert support, the Linux Foundation training site. They're fantastic.
Until next time.
Happy documenting.